Good morning, comrades. You are listening to WHIV-LP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning, Comrade. Got a very special guest today, Mike Duncan. He is the host of the Revolutions podcast, and which is just wrapping up kind of in these last couple of weeks. And then he was also the host of the History of Rome podcast, which I listened to, I think, probably twice because I'm insane. Yeah, I've been listening. I've been listening to your stuff for a long time, Mike. Say hello to the people.
Hello, people. Good morning, comrades.
We're recording a little bit early. We were recording, actually. It's funny that we sort of ended up this way because they have this giant election that's supposed to be happening like the Tuesday as of recording, but it's going to be the radio version is going to be dropping on Saturday. So let's not like make it about that. And I don't think make a whole lot of predictions because we could look like a bunch of dinguses.
So this is going to be running after the election happens.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll most likely we'll all be on several barricades.
I mean. Look, I hope that's not the case.
We don't have to talk about the election.
I hope that's not true for a lot of reasons, but like especially, but to kind of talk about barricades and get involved in, I guess, right into it. So, I guess, do you want to just talk about revolutions and like what got you to begin that podcast? What got you to sort of like drive you through this entire 9 years project?
I'm right at 9 years. I just went over 9 years, and it started in September of 2013. When Revolution started.
Yeah, you want to talk about like what, especially coming after the History of Rome, what kind of like got you into? Why did you want to do this? I guess
there were a bunch of different things that kind of fed into revolutions being the right idea for me. So I did the History of Rome. I started that in July of 2007, and that ran through 2012. And when I wrapped that up, I knew I wanted to go on and do another podcast. And most people were expecting me to, do like the history of ancient Greece or like the Peloponnesian War or, ancient civilizations. And really, like when I was moving out of the History of Rome, I didn't want to box myself in permanently just to the ancient world. I have more interests in that. My interests are broader and more general than that. So I knew I wanted to move into more modern-ish history to avoid getting, typecast as just an ancient history guy. And revolutions is something like the sort of the actions, the context, the event of a revolution, I think is something that is inherently interesting, right? I think that it inherently draws people's attention, and it certainly draws my attention. It's a giant fire, like it's a giant bonfire. If you're looking at all of history, like what are the most interesting things that are going on here? A revolution is something that I think is like particularly interesting to the human mind.
Why do you think that's interesting? Why do you think they're so interesting? I don't mean to interrupt you, but like you say that you think that they're interesting, and I agree, but like I kind of like to kind of noodle on like what is so like obviously it's like great tumult and that there's a reason there's a significant shift that's taking place within like societies and stuff like that, but like I don't know, maybe that's just self-evidently interesting, I suppose.
I think that's part of it. I think it's self-evidently interesting. And what I'm talking about right now, like I'm wrapping up Revolutions right now, and sort of I'm producing these appendices episodes that we're going back and we're sort of looking at everything that I talked about over the last 9 years, these 10 or 12 great revolutions that I covered. And the thing about revolutions is that they are incredibly rare events. This is something that I do talk about, is most of the time, most places are not convulsed by revolutions. And most of the time, people are just muddling along politically and socially and economically. And so a whole confluence of things needs to occur for something as insanely tumultuous as a revolution to break out. So that's just one thing. Like, it is a unicorn type event in history. We can look back and say, oh, there have been many revolutions in history, but the number of revolutions in history that have happened is dwarfed by the number of not revolutions that have happened in history. Most of the time, it's people, just like I say, just kind of muddling along through life. And the other part of it, though, is that revolutions, like if you're looking at a revolution as a historical event, you are going to wind up talking about and needing to talk about like almost every facet of that society. So if you're interested in economics, or you're interested in politics, or you're interested in culture, material culture, language, gender politics, racial politics, like most of these things are going to be fed into one of these great revolutions, and you're going to wind up talking about these things. And of course, they're also the, they're the pivot points of any historical process, right? Mm-hmm. They are a time and a place where there was something that was before, and there's something that was after, and then this is the hinge point. And this is why I think, like, just naturally, we look to these moments and say, oh, this is something that is really worth investigating, because we're going to learn a lot about the society and, a lot about ourselves if we're talking about our own histories, in talking about the revolutions that made the societies that we presently live in.
Yeah, it's almost like almost the seemingly like the most fundamental questions that exist within, or I guess the most fundamental like assumptions that people sort of take for granted on a day-to-day basis. Revolutions are so upsetting to even like that, to the basic order of the entire world or
exactly
society. It's really like it's hard to understate like how disruptive these things can be to an established order. And there's definitely a lot more to talk about there. But it's literally like up is down at times.
And that's the thing. And sideways is sideways, right? Mm-hmm. And it's never, revolutions are never just binary events. There's always, 10, 12, 15 different ways that a revolution could wind up. And like you say, I think everything gets on the table and everything gets discussed in really active ways. People are contesting the basic norms of society, the basic rules of society, the basic habits of society. And when you get people doing those kinds of things, this is something that, at least for me, I tend to like turn my attention to and be like, this is very interesting to me. And so, like, going back to like your very original question there, I'm coming out of the history of Rome. I want to move into something that is more modern. And just growing up as a kid, I was very interested in both the American Revolution and the Russian Revolution, because I'm like the last of the Cold War kids. I do sometimes joke that I'm the last person who remembers the Cold War, because like the Berlin Wall came down when I was 9 years old. And if you were just a couple years younger than me, you probably don't remember the Berlin Wall coming down at all. And even as a 9-year-old, most 9-year-olds were not like that interested in current events that way to like really be aware of what was going on and like watch it on the news, which I did, because I was weirdly precocious about politics and history.
Well, congratulations!
And have been from the beginning.
Congratulations on being the first millennial or the last Gen Xer. I'm not sure which one that is.
Oh yeah, well I'm of this little. We're very protective of our bit of territory. There's a number of different names for us. It's those of us who were born like 77 to about 82. We're Zennials. We are the Oregon Trail generation, because I'm too young. I'm too young to be Gen X. But I'm too old really to be a millennial. Yeah. So, this little cohort.
I was just gonna say I got a little bit of that because I'm like 84, born in 84. So like I definitely like was not consciously like I know like wow I see like David Hasselhoff in Germany when the Berlin Wall is falling or whatever, but I don't know what's going on. But definitely like some of the later sides of Oregon Trail. I got the updates for Windows for the Oregon Trail.
Yeah. See, we were playing the original, and then you would type in your buddy's name, and it's like West died of dysentery, and we'd all laugh. But if you were born in 84, like you don't remember like watching on the news the Berlin Wall coming down, right? Because you were 5 at the time, or do you?
I mean, you can know that something is happening. You can definitely remember like pictures of like David Hasselhoff singing about freedom, and that's one of the most enduring memories for me, I guess.
That's what it is for you.
Yeah. The Baywatch guy was
Oh,
like,
man.
what, this guy, just became like synonymous with Germany for some reason.
Well, because Germans love David Hasselhoff.
Yeah, I'm not sure why.
As Norm Macdonald taught us all repeatedly over the years, Germans love David Hasselhoff.
Yeah, it's
but
true.
you know
It's so true.
what's actually interesting. I don't usually get this deep into the weeds on this question, but you guys might might find this interesting that the actual specific pivot from the history of Rome to revolutions was I was going to go back to school and get a master's degree in public history because that's really what I do. I'm a public facing historian and communicator. But when I applied to school, it turns out that I didn't actually have enough undergrad history credits to qualify for a history master's program because I had studied political science and philosophy as an undergrad. So I was living in Austin at the time. And I went to UT and I took a couple of classes just to get the requisite stuff. And one of the classes was like a Latino history class, and specifically like Tejano history, like the Latino population in Texas, and then also the guys in California. And one of the books that we read in there was about the United Farm Workers Movement, and
nice.
it was a book about actually the guys who actually ran the union, as opposed to Che himself. Or not Jay.
Chavez.
Yeah, Chavez. Sorry. I always do that. And there I did. I cursed on your radio show.
Fine.
Right. That's what I did. You can blip that out.
I will.
But so it was a book about the United Farm Workers Movement, which started out, as very much about just like securing bathrooms and breaks and like shade spots and better wages and. What's that?
The basics, like the most basic things that you can possibly expect, like that you should have for workers. It's it's really. I mean, I don't mean to keep interrupting you, but I do want to sort of like put a point on this is that we have situations that are very sort of similar, just in different conditions when it comes to. I mean, I talk about this way too much, but we just on our last show talked with Mandy Landry, who's actually running for Louisiana State Senate around here. One of the things that came up is worker misclassification for workers that are they don't have status, they don't have immigration status, right? And they essentially are so taken advantage of because they have no recourse in the system that we currently have. But and essentially, so essentially, these are questions from the 1960s that are not settled right now.
Oh yeah, and this is what the book was talking about is that so they waged this battle right in California, and they do get recognized as a union. They do start fighting for these basic causes. And then the movement kind of split in two between the unionist wing of this fight, who do really want to now focus on sort of like the legalistic stuff, going around having inspections, making sure all these conditions are met. And then what Cesar Chavez wanted was far more of a sort of political and ideological movement to expand out. Like he was interested in far more than just sort of the nuts and bolts of unionization. He believed that was a launching pad for a much larger social movement. And so, for example, he did not want any of the union organizers to be paid. He thought that they should be doing this as like volunteering for this larger purpose and larger movement. And people were saying but I need gas reimbursement if I'm going to go around and organize things. And he was kind of against that. And so in the 70s, the movement got kind of very weird and strange and a little bit cultish. If you start studying what was going on in 75 and 76 and 77 and all of this, as I was reading this book and I had to write a paper about it. And I was like, this movement is kind of following a little bit kind of the general patterns that I remember from my days of studying revolutions when I was younger, which is it kind of starts out with these limited aims and then it becomes subsequently more radicalized. And then there's a Termidorian reaction, which did kind of happen. There was conflict inside of it as people then opposed, sort of the more messianic qualities of the United Farm Workers Movement. And so I picked up this very old book that I had read called Anatomy of Revolution by Crane Brinton, and I applied the structure of Crane Brinton's book Anatomy of Revolution to the United Farm Workers Movement, wrote a paper about that, And then I was sitting there, I had just ended the history of Rome and was like, oh man, this is what I should do. I should talk about these great revolutions in history. And like just a little light bulb went off in my head. It was the second good idea that I've ever had in my life. I've had about 5.
Yeah, there you go.
maybe 6, non-family division. But I think I've had like 5 or 6 good ideas that actually worked of the many thousands of ideas that have run through my noodle over the years. So that was back in 2012, and I've been doing revolutions ever since. And it's just now ending. I'm wrapping it up, which I also think is a good idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely going to let you get control over your life in a lot of ways, I'm sure, or at least let you focus on other projects, because that could be
there's other things to be done.
I mean, look, I look at the bibliographies of the work that you do, and I just see like book after book after book. It's just so many, like so much work that you're pulling from too, and the perspective that you're providing is, I think, fairly balanced.
Yeah, and one thing that I'm excited about is that over the last 15 years, I've basically had 2 things that I've been allowed to study. One of them was ancient Rome, which for about 5-7 years, all I did was read books about ancient Rome. And for the past 9 years or so, all I've done is read on topic, because I have to put out a new episode every week. So like that kind of consumes my life. So I haven't really been able to read off topic in like 15 years. So when I finally wrap up the show, I have this book list, right? All these books that I have not been able to read over the years. Is people like, have you read this book? Have you read this book? I was just out with some guys in Brooklyn. They were like, have you read this book? Have you read? I'm like, no, I haven't read that book. I had to explain 1848 to everybody. And that's all I did was read about 1848 for like a year. You understand what it is that I do here. But when I put bibliographies together, one of the things that I am interested in is reading from the widest possible sort of from a historiographic perspective, both ideological takes on all the various revolutions, and also like temporally, I like to read the things that are the works that were produced closest to the revolution, kind of by people who were participants in it, and then the first generation after, the second generation after, the third generation after, to kind of follow how these events get treated in our collective consciousness, because the French Revolution is both a historic event that occurred and also an ongoing topic of debate in any current political situation, not just in France, but I think across the globe. Like what you think about the French Revolution and how you perceive the French Revolution and portray the French Revolution says a lot about what you think about contemporary politics. And so I like following that. And then I want to know what conservatives think about the French Revolution. I want to know what Marxists think about it. I want to know what anarchists think about it. So that when I sit down to then craft my narrative, I sort of feel like I have all the pieces in place, and I haven't had anything overly emphasized or de-emphasized, and I know what critiques people are making of each other, so that I can be like, well, this is a critique that you're making, but I don't happen to agree with it, or something that maybe I would have naturally agreed with, that then I hear a really good critique of it, and I'm like, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense. So I will try to give a more nuanced version of events here, and then hopefully then just sort of like dump out what is something resembling an objective and factual accounting of events, which is what I'm trying to do, to then give people this, I guess, the tools they need to inform their own perspective of history.
So I just want to circle back a little bit, and you mentioned because you mentioned the sort of idea that that Chavez had, that essentially, like, the idea of paid staff and paid organizers that are on staff for a union is something that he thought was kind of a bit problematic or counter-revolutionary or things like that. And that's a debate that actually like continues to rage on within like the like modern labor movement. Even there's this sort of idea that and I think it's a little bit sort of self-destructive in a lot of ways, from a perspective of, like, obviously you are going to have, if you're going to have a movement that's large enough, if you're going to have something that's functional, you're going to have people who do that at least to some extent for a living. And like especially if it's going to be something that's going to be so big and so broad and so like counter to the current like the way that capital is organized in this country. Like, if you want to have like workers have any kind of chance for representation in any kind of coherent way, you need to have ways to distill those voices. And I actually understand the perspective on the back end too of of like those, I'm a union member. I talk about this, fairly often. Many times it feels like the people who do have those positions, might, be it in good faith or bad faith, not always take into account exactly every the main will of the members, because they have to go along to get along in a separate world, and it's just a very complicated wire to walk.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think that there's a right or a wrong answer to that part of it, because I of course understand the notion that, like, look, if I'm going to be driving around organizing people, I need to get paid for this. Like I have rent, I have gas bills, I have to feed myself, and I have to be able to do this. I can't go do a full-time job and then also do this and completely commit myself to everything. So it makes sense on a very practical level to pay people and have a permanent union staff and permanent, union organizers. As you just said, though, once that happens, you have created a power structure that is independent of the interests of the people who are the membership, right? And the institution of the union then becomes interested in itself and getting paid by the union. Now you're no longer a worker; you are a function of the union, and that becomes its own little power structure. And we know, I'm as pro-union as it gets, really. Even though I'm coming out of everybody knows I come out of a liberal tradition and have been progressively drifting left over the past 10 years. But I've always been very pro-union. We know that unions can be corrupt. We know that unions sell out, can sell out the actual rank and file, negotiators go off, the people at the top go off, they make some deal, they're getting kickbacks to make a certain deal, and then they say, hey, here's your contract, and the people don't actually like it, which I think a lot of that can come from this is what Cesar Chavez wanted to avoid. He didn't want those kinds of things going on. He wanted the movement to maintain a kind of purity, which I think does make sense in its own way. But it is hard then to actually organize, because you're asking people to work very hard full-time jobs and then also go off and do this other stuff.
Yeah, it's again like a very difficult line to balance. Let me just pause real quick for station ID. You are listening to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade. More information about Good Morning Comrade at goodmorningcomrade.com. We have Mike Duncan, the host and creator of the Revolutions podcast, the History of Rome podcast, and also the author of two books as well. Hero of Two Worlds, about the Marquis of Lafayette, and what was Storm Before the Storm? The fall of the Roman. The beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. Yeah, yes, it's a very specific slice of Roman history. Yeah, I should have it in front of me, but this is community radio, and I'm doing my best. Anyway, you mentioned just a moment ago you're sort of like coming from a liberal tradition and then having some movement. Kind of on that, I'm interested in that question in a couple of ways. One, what has that progression sort of been? And two, is that influenced or informed by covering these kinds of things for a living for many years? I can't imagine it not, but I mean, I guess maybe more so, how is that the case? Yeah, I think how is the question, because I do sometimes get people asking me hey, do you think that your perspective on things has changed with having done revolutions? And it's yeah, I've read 500 or 600 books or something. Of course my perspective has changed. It would be it would be like a tragedy. Think about, you have to be a real stubborn dude. You have to be a real stubborn dude to have no to read 500, let's say, books and not have your opinion change about anything. That's a tragedy. That's an intellectual tragedy right there. So no, my perspective has absolutely changed in the 9 years and all of the reading that I have done. But yeah, so it's really a matter of how has it changed, not whether it has changed. And yeah, like I said earlier, when I went to school, I studied. My concentration was political theory, studied political science and philosophy. And the people I was drawn to and the people that I studied the most were kind of Scottish Enlightenment and post-Scottish Enlightenment people. So I was reading Smith, I was reading Hume, and then the utilitarians, and then kind of the capstone to all this is John Stuart Mill. And so that's really kind of
the place that I went through school and emerged from university, having sort of lived in most of my intellectual life, which is solid liberal tradition. Although somebody told me one time, and I did actually find this to be very true, that if you read like Theory of Moral Sentiments and you actually read Wealth and Nations, that you will find that it is incontrovertibly true that Adam Smith and Karl Marx have more in common with each other than any I think person today who says I'm a follower of Adam Smith has with Adam Smith. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure this is something that is very well known.
People that fetishize Adam Smith are just like basically people that like love Hayek and just don't want to say it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but if you actually go read Adam Smith, you're like, oh, okay, well, and that's the thing is like, so my liberalism per se was always sort of it was always a left leaning liberalism. I always liked the New Deal and I like Roosevelt, and I at times describe myself as a neo Rooseveltian. So that's kind of my starting point here. And then just, over the past 10 years, doing all of these revolutions, which has also been, when you study great revolutions of like, say, the European world and the Atlantic world, which is where I'm living, you're also doing a general history of that. Of this civilization that's kind of unfolding. And so as I watched civilization unfold through these revolutionary tumults, the great questions that started coming into it, the political question, then being modified by the social question, then I am reading these things and I'm doing sort of deep thoughts about, I maybe took it for granted earlier that if you set up a regime with the political bones of like a constitution, a bill of rights, citizens and voting and legislatures, like if you erect that political apparatus to create a society that can now be defined as free, and then everything else just sort of let it fall where it may, right? Because we have sort of a solidly free society, and whatever happens after that just kind of happens in the freewheeling and dealing of humans running into each other, because most of the time we're just individual private humans talking to each other, and that's all well and good. But as I move forward, and I think that this is something that was definitely modified by specifically doing revolutions, which is like these really basic questions. Well, if you're working 2 full-time jobs and you don't, and that's not even enough to pay like the rent and bills, if basically you're doing this this working poverty thing that is everywhere in the United States of America, is anything resembling liberty going on here?
No, of course not.
No, like not really. Like this is like, and if you take seriously as I do, and as most of the socialists that I started reading did, concepts like liberty and equality, like those notions that came out of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, like they need to be modified by material conditions in order to actually create the kind of liberty and equality that at least I'm interested in. And so, and then the other bit of it is that's coming out of the revolution stuff. And then also just like, I started the Revolutions podcast in 2013, which was just coming out of the financial crash of like 2008, 2009, and sort of everything that was churned up by that moment in history, which I still think is like probably, even with everything else that has gone on, I still kind of point to that as like the defining moment of, I think, my lifetime. Like, even though like COVID has been crazy, also a defining moment in all of our lives. But I still look at the 2008, 2009 sort of financial crash and economic crisis as probably the principal turning point. And that too, like I'm watching all of those current events unfold. I'm watching how we respond to it. I am watching our failure to respond to it in anything resembling a just way while I'm studying all of these revolutions. And I think I became a bit unmoored from my traditional liberalism and have been drifting on a very warm current to the left ever since.
I think about this a lot, and I talk about this a lot on the show. So people who are listening might just be like, "Duh, he's on about it again." Shut up, Jeff. But obviously the what you talked about in 2008, the financial crisis, has been like one of the most kind of pivotal moments in the history, which I'm sure also changed your perspective in some ways. But like I think about people that are like our age, obviously just a couple of years older than me, but it's not that significant. But like people that are my age, for example, like when I just became an adult, and I was in high school when, 9/11, I was a junior in high school when 9/11 happened. And that was a hugely transformative moment in the history of this country. And prior to that was the 2000 election, which also was like another like thing that sort of like shook a lot of confidence and faith, and then for people like me that lived in New Orleans, you would see like government failure because of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and then 2008, and it's just like and then you get this sort of like Occupy Wall Street, and then eventually, I mean, I think I'm Bernie Sanders coming after that is also sort of like, so you just basically see everything from the moment you're becoming like kind of an adult until you're basically ready, or actually you've been working for a few years, or you're getting out of college or whatever in 2008, and you just see the entire everything fall apart over almost a decade. You know what I mean? And then you finally, for the first time in your life, see like a little bit of hope. And I think that's sort of like why they have a generation of people right now that feel that they don't have a future and are essentially like
there's
in the system.
There's a real generational divide out there that I feel actually very strongly, because I'm, like I said at the beginning, like I'm just on the very back end of like I'm 42 right now, and I was 21 when 9/11 happened. And there is such a gap in perspective and in sort of like like household wealth, wages, like all of these things, like the over 40 set and the under 40 set have been living in two different worlds.
Yeah.
And this is something that when you go talk to, and like, God bless them, these are my parents friends, my aunts and uncles. But you talk to boomers and older Generation X people, and they're like, oh, why are you complaining about student debt? Like, why don't you just go get a summer job and pay for your tuition? Because it's only $300, because the state has been subsidizing it at a clip of 90% the whole time you were in school. And then when you guys got power, you took all of that away and put the entire burden of paying for school onto the students themselves, which was never the case when you were growing up. And then you say, oh, well, these kids today, why won't they stop complaining? When you look at how much housing costs right now versus when they were buying into houses, and it's just not even, it's just two completely different worlds. And I do think that there is also, this is something that I went through actually quite personally, because growing up in the 80s and 90s and coming out of kind of a liberal tradition, the 1990s were an incredibly optimistic period in my life. It was just like, we won, freedom and democracy, and it's the end of the end of history business, which I never fully bought into, because I knew enough about history to know that things just kept going. But it did seem like liberal capitalist democracy was just going to kind of like flourish, and everybody was going to prosper. And like, I was young, okay, I was naive, like I do absolutely like cop to that.
Fukuyama.
But then heading. Yeah.
Who's backed off of the end of history now? He's backed off of it in a lot of ways.
The thing is about that poor guy, he didn't even mean what we all said that he meant, right? He said like this one line, and then he got saddled with it, and then that's a concept that is actually kind of divorced from anything that he was actually saying at the time, which is something I do, I understand now. But the point being that basically the first half of my life was just a procession of triumphs.
Yeah.
And the second half of my life, I feel like, has been, with exception, a procession of like defeats and failures and various collapses. And what we're heading into right now with this election that, by the time you're hearing this, has just happened, the midterms, and then what's going to happen in 2024. And we have a full-blown, basically, I don't even think we need to call them proto-fascist or neo-fascist or crypto-fascist or any other semi-fascist. I don't think we need any of these words. It's
you don't need the qualifiers
that
much.
The only qualifier that I put on it is it's American fascism, right? Because I think that there is a thing about. Yeah, there is a thing about fascism that it's always going to have its particular national characteristics, because it's a nationalistic movement. So Italian fascism is subtly different from German fascism, which is subtly different from Japanese fascism. We all know this. And so like when you hear these arguments about whether or not we're dealing with a fascism, you just say it's an American fascist movement. It's fascism with American characteristics, right? That's what it is. And that's what we're dealing with, which is something that was I don't really feel you could always see it, and you can trace the through lines of this movement on back through to Pat Buchanan and John Birch Society. Like this movement has always been here.
Can we do
but
that
it
in
has
just a moment?
exploded.
It's bottom of the hour. I got to do station ID,
Yeah, for
but
sure.
I would like to get into that. I'm sorry to cut you off, but you're listening to Good Morning Comrade, WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. We have Mike Duncan on the show. We're talking about revolutions and also sort of the, I guess, American fascism right now. We're talking about fascism in America and sort of like the conditions that led us to this point. And you were mentioning Buchanan and a lot of these, like, you know, people that would call themselves also euphemistically like paleo conservatives and things like that.
Right.
I guess go on, and I wanted to sort of ask, like, what are the conditions that have I can actually the conditions that are essentially like flaming fascism are the same conditions that are inflaming this sort of like new emerging, I guess you would say, like left movement in America.
Yeah, and this is why I tend to look a lot at 2008 and 2009 as something that mattered a lot in American history. But there's never going to be any one thing that you can point to and say, like, well, this is when it all came around. Because my friend Spencer Ackerman wrote a very good book called Reign of Terror that really links, everything that we see in the MAGA movement today back to through the lens of basically of 9/11. That 9/11 really did unleash a lot of sort of xenophobic warmongering, nationalist, a renationalizing of the American consciousness in the sense of we once again have a them that is, these but which they called Islamo-fascists. They just sort of like invented these things. Which isn't like actually a thing. I mean, there's theocrats, they're autocratic theocrats, and they suck, and they fucking, I did it again. And I hate these guys. This goes back, there's just benchmarks to it. And the thing is, a lot of what we're seeing right now, as you said, right, which is, when you look at the origins of fascism and the sort of the ideals and the mentalities that even informed the Germans and the Italians back in the early 20th century, a lot of that was also present simultaneously in the United States because of the institutions that the United States has been built on. There is something, and this is also, I think, part of a bit of my divergence from my liberal friends and from my former liberalism, is that there's this notion that the MAGA movement and Trump himself are like sui generis, like new things that have entered the body politic, that there was this thing called the United States of America that was good and just and noble, and it has now been infected by this virus. But unfortunately,
those people haven't been listening to AM talk radio since the 1980s.
Yeah, and also don't really know anything about American history from its founding.
Correct.
which is the other problem. These aren't new things, and a lot of what MAGA is trying to accomplish is to resurrect a lot of the institutions politically, socially, and culturally that have actually defined American history for most of American history, and that the sort of divergence in American history, if you're going to call it that, is this sort of post-World War II rights revolution that did go on. Civil rights and women's rights and LGBT rights. There was a lot that was going on during this period after World War II that's the unique part of American history, as opposed to what is going on right now, which is a lot of return to form, which is deeply unsettling.
Yeah, and you mentioned like some of these specific things. I can put like some specific stuff to it. So I've been knocking on doors for various candidates for the upcoming election that will have been passed by the time that you're listening to this. But like sometimes I'm knocking on the door for somebody for school board, for example, and they want to know, like the people at the door sometimes will ask you, well, what is this school board member's position on something like abortion? And it's like, what, you want me to just say like no abortion in schools or something? Like, I don't understand. Like, what's going on here? Like why do you care? This is school district. This is school board stuff. What does that have to do with education? What does that have to do with anything? It's about it's and. If it's obviously you try to deflect from these kind of things when you're talking to people, but it's just like one of those kind of things where people will make their decisions on like voting issues, which is how a lot of this sort of like angst gets translated in like in some ways. I mean, obviously there's violence and there's these, rallies, and also there's, I mean, look at Facebook. That's another way that people kind of release a lot of their anger and angst about these things. But it's really interesting to me that somebody would care what a school board school board candidate would, what their position on abortion would be, because it's got nothing to do with the position, but people are going to make their decisions based off of that for one example. We've re-entered a kind of political tribalism in that way, and all of that feeds into the sort of the broad nationalization of politics, where people have become, because I think largely because of the internet and mass media in general, that we tend to see all things through the lens of these big national issues, instead of like, well, what's actually going on in this local school, and what are people actually doing, as opposed to what am I seeing on the news that I now need to respond to. So there's like 3 or 5 issues. Well, I'm surprised they didn't ask you like what's their position on like capital gains taxes, right? Like that's going to inform my decision about who should run for school board. Yeah. You would be surprised that actually does matter to a certain extent here, because they have this thing called the industrial tax exemption program that like essentially allows for businesses to expand their business, and all the capital that would be put towards that is essentially not taxed. So it's huge savings for these companies, and they go through like local approval, like through school boards and local like parish councils or city councils and all these other local entities, which is just like. Well, first off, the program itself, I've had people talk about that on this show in the past, and it's just like one of those things that's just like mind blowing. Like it's just giving away the farm to ExxonMobil and companies like that. But it's just also at the same time, like, I don't know. Some of those taxes, it's obviously not capital gains tax. It's a little bit of a different situation, but it's like one of those sort of things that it's just like, why is the school board making this decision? Oh, because this tax money would be going to the school board otherwise.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we need to rethink a lot of different things. But I semi-retract my loose aside about capital gains taxes, because apparently it does matter in the very specific case of New Orleans, which sounds a lot like what would go on like in French Revolutionary times, like just before the Revolution, when anybody, which is something that's been going on a lot and more, which is the people that have the most amount of money are the people who are most exempt from taxation, and that's not a firm basis for a society.
Yeah. How will the dog catcher combat inflation? Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to like get off on that aside, but it's like to get sort of back to the original point, like you are seeing this sort of emergence of like a reactionary right, and also like it's largely like capital class, and it's largely skews older, but it's not just older, because they have these like, I don't know, I kind of like when you mentioned in the French Revolution the sort of Muscadin like reactionary like foot soldiers or whatever. Youth. Yeah. Like that, when I saw that Unite the Right rally with all these like dudes in polo shirts like walking around the street talking about how Jews will not replace us or whatever, like how could you not make that connection in a lot of ways?
Those are the Muscadin youth, for sure. Yeah, the kids coming out of the country clubs to bash heads.
Yeah,
are actually a thing, and I think that there is. It's very difficult to, like, in the brief amount of time that we're going to have together, to like disentangle everything.
Yeah.
But there was, I think, and it probably still is among a certain set, this belief that what we're seeing right now is sort of like the primal scream, like the final existential burst of a generation that is dying away, that feels its power. In the twilight of their life, they see the America that they believed in slipping away from them. And so they want to push back against all of that and try to hold on and recreate something like what they remember. And that this doesn't actually have anything to do with people in their teens or in their 20s or in their 30s or in their 40s. That's not something that I really recognize.
Yeah.
Because I do see these people existent. We know that kids are coming up through internet culture that is very reactionary, very right wing, very misogynistic, very racist. All of those ideas are widely disseminated among basically your edgelord 15-year-olds.
Yeah, if you play Call of Duty, if you play Call of Duty online with the voice chat on, you're going to hear every slur in the book.
Yep.
From a squeaky voiced.
I don't do that, but I believe it.
From a squeaky voiced little like Jimmy Timmy on the other end too.
Yeah. Okay. It's all very disturbing. So there are some things that clearly I think, the youth of America, such as they are, I used to be a part of the youth of America. And then the next thing I knew, I had like kids and a mortgage, and I realized I was not speaking for the youth of America anymore.
Yeah. Your back hurts a lot more.
Yeah. I'm just, I don't know what I am, petty bourgeois, middle-aged guy. I'm artisan class, I'm artisan intellectual.
Yeah, that's what the Chapo guys say.
No bosses, no employees. That's the road for me. What was I saying? Yeah, that there are certain cultural issues that I think matter a lot less. One would hope that on all LGBT issues that like the kids just don't seem to care that much, as much anymore. Certainly not in the way that they would have 15 years ago or 20 years ago. So I do see some sort of habitual cultural things are different, but is racism about to end because the boomers are going to die? No, I'm sorry, not at all.
Yeah.
And is capitalism going to die out because all the kids are a part of the Bernie Sanders socialist left? No.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen either. It's going to be a fight and a struggle intra-generationally as well as intergenerationally.
Yeah. You're listening to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade. I did want to kind of point out that Mike came to New Orleans a little while ago to talk about his book, the Hero of Two Worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette and the Age of Revolution, You made a point to make that distinction during your talk, but also
in the Age of Revolution.
Oh, in the Age of Revolution. You see, I got it wrong.
The Age of Revolution.
I should have been listening. But anyway, one of the cool things that Mike did was he came to visit some of the folks from DSA New Orleans. Which I'm a member, at one of our brake light clinics. And I guess, that would be first off, thanks for coming. Thanks for dropping by. We had some drinks and stuff after, and we had a great time.
We did.
And I guess that I use that as a jumping off point to ask this question, which is, you are seeing a certain amount of, like I said before, I think the appropriate word is emerging sort of left, sort of a left coming up. It's nowhere near as well funded or as like heavily organized as the sort of right wing operations are. But I guess what do you make of this sort of development that it's been probably, the seeds of it were planted at least in really. I mean, obviously there was always like some kind of nascent left that existed in America, but it was sort of planted in terms of or at the time of, I guess, Occupy Wall Street, and sort of learned at least how to engage directly politically in the, with the 2016 and 2020 Bernie Sanders campaigns. I guess, what do you make of what the state of the left is, I guess, and like where we're at is sort of like what I'm doing a long wind up to this question of.
Yeah, well, I think that my coming up. Let's see, the first election that I was a part of was 1998. That was like the first year that I voted, and back then there was no left in my world.
Certainly not a political left in any way.
Yeah, exactly. And so I came up in, I'm from the Pacific Northwest. So I went to school in this little state college called Western Washington University, which had a very large, kind of hippie component to it. Like it was a lot of back to nature hippie types who that was sort of what the left was. There was a very strong hippie left. Very where I lived in Bellingham, Washington, lots of Nader voters. And so this to me, I was really hostile. Very, very hostile to the Nader hippie left in Bellingham, Washington, because I was coming from a very practical place, which is I identified Bush as a very troubling candidate very early, and was like, you guys, we have to beat Bush. That's the thing. And this is a lot of like what my mentality was through the next couple of cycles, is that there's something happening over here with the Republicans that I think is worse than anything that is happening with these moderate Democrats that you're really, really opposed to. So I supported Gore. I supported Kerry. I expected Gore to come back in 2008, to be perfectly honest with you. I lost $100 because Al Gore traveled. He traveled around on an inconvenient truth, and I was like, he's doing it. He's coming back. He's gonna pull the reverse Nixon.
The problem is that he did it on a private plane, and that was just like, now he's just gonna take every arrow for that one, which is so silly.
Yeah,
it's so silly.
But and then of course also like the WTO protests happened in Seattle.
Yeah.
Like I missed the WTO protests because I had gone to a concert out in the Gorge that weekend, and we drove back from the Gorge back up to Bellingham, and we're like, should we stop for these WTO protests? And I'm going to be honest with you. We were very tired because of a number of substances that we had taken at the concert, and so we were like, no, let's just keep going. So I missed the WTO stuff mostly because of things that I had done at the concert, which is very enlightening and stuff.
Yeah.
But the point being that I think that through those years, kind of, it was very easy to dismiss whatever the Kucinich left. That was sort of existed during this period. And then again, the financial crisis comes along. And I think that what that did for me, I think too, is I think that I'm thinking out loud a little bit right now, that coming out of the Cold War, my mentality was like, sort of like, liberal capitalism and democracy won. Communism, Marxism lost, right? Like there was this close to century-long conflict between these two ideologies. One of them was superior and triumphed. The other failed because of its many problems, contradictions, and slide into sort of totalitarian autocracies that, were not able to provide for the basic needs of their society. So that's, I think, the mentality that I entered the 1990s with. And then when I got to the financial crisis and everything that was going on for there, I think that's when it started churning in my head that like, well, okay, maybe actually not everything that the Marxists were saying and that socialists were saying and that communists were saying about the nature of capitalism were incorrect. And that we actually do need something like a hard challenge from that wing of our consciousness in order to combat what's going on, which is deunionization, deregulation, the dismantling of all social programs, all of which I believed in because I'm coming out of sort of a New Deal tradition. This is where I am mentally. When all of those institutions of the left were dismantled, what we see is an incredibly toxic austerity program that was implemented after that crisis, which is the pinnacle. And we saw this in Europe too. I lived in Europe for 3 years in order to write the book, and so I got a nice perspective on them too. Is those guys, the sort of the capitalist wing and the Davos wing of Europe, they were so excited by the financial crisis because they were finally going to be able to dismantle the social welfare state that they had erected only as a bulwark against communist infiltration of Western Europe. So the only reason they do these things is because they were afraid of the communists. And now they hadn't been able to dismantle it because everybody had gotten used to and accustomed to these things. And then when the financial crisis comes along, they're like, oh man, we can't afford to have like healthcare and unions anymore. Like we just have to cut all of this stuff. They've been waiting in the tall grass to do that for 20 years after the Berlin Wall came down. And then they finally got the opportunity to do it. So all of those things, when I look right now at the left, the thing that most excites me is reunionization. Right. I think that's, and I don't know if I'm crossing any advocacy lines here, but okay, good. My considered opinion on all of this.
Unions are cool.
Unions are good. And unions are good not just for protecting workers from an incredibly insecure environment where everybody wakes up every day not sure whether or not they're going to be laid off or have a job or have health care. What happens if I get sick? All of these things that used to have an answer because of unions now don't have an answer, and it leaves us all very insecure. So seeing reunionization, I think, is a critical component of any reestablishment of the left, because the left can't survive just as a political party, right? DSA can't survive just as a political party. It needs that organizational component economically and socially in order to sort of provide the, for lack of a better word, like the muscle and the votes and the power to actually fuel the movement, which I think could and should and needs to be somewhat of a separate component from the political party apparatus itself, right? I do think that the labor unions need to maintain their own independent identity separate from whatever political party is going to be representing them. Because what the Democratic Party would like to do is just to have everything get folded into the Democratic Party establishment. Yep. And all they want from people, now I'm getting on my high horse here.
No, go ahead.
All these people want from us is to provide one vote per year, per election, and give $3 to every single campaign, which is what all of our email inboxes are currently flooded with, which is, can't you just give $3? They want from us is monetary donations and one vote. And that's all that they expect in terms of political participation in American society. And that's not enough.
Yeah,
and so that's, I think, where a lot of what is fueling, they think that it's continuing to fuel a left-wing movement inside that establishment, inside of American politics, is because that's not satisfactory. It's not satisfactory to me to be told the only thing that I should do is vote once and give a couple of dollars. That's not enough.
It's not enough, and also, like, it is a recipe for like complete and utter disaster, if you ask me. I mean, like, if you're essentially saying that you can just like set democracy or whatever. Democracy is on the ballot in every election, essentially, and all you have to do is turn out and vote Dem. Then, like, if you do that, and then like that's essentially the entirety of your political program, you're essentially like deflecting or misdirecting from what the Democrats themselves are attempting to do. And again, like, the situation that they have here, and is like, they're going to send you these emails, Mike, it's Nancy, I'm really hoping that you can help me out, and she's like turning out her pockets she's like she's broke or something, and it's so annoying. I get those emails and it's so annoying, but
it's so annoying. And that's the thing, like, people are like, again getting back to like that original, like, it's doing revolutions influenced you, like, yes, it has, but also just like my encounters with American society as it is currently functioning is also the thing that's just like, this strategically is awful. And every single time that, like, there does start to be some kind of popular either protest movement or demonstration movement, or there is an opportunity for sort of grassroots demonstrations of groups of people, it feels a lot like the Democratic Party grandees just want to short circuit it and sabotage it and send everybody home and just say, this isn't the way. The only way to do anything is just to vote that one time in that one election, and that's the only thing that you're allowed to do. And anything else we're going to be really afraid of and try to dismantle as quickly as humanly possible.
Yeah, they say that openly. Is like when you have protests in the street of people who are like upset about George Floyd being like murdered by police, and have a foot on his head or his neck or whatever, and like people are out in the streets, they're essentially like saying, and people are saying, like, again, the messaging is the messaging that that the movements are going to have. They're saying defund the police and all these other things, and you can agree with that or you can disagree with that or whatever. What you cannot do is say, well, you people that are upset with all of these police murders that are happening all over the country, and it's a really big deal, and the way that we're going to solve it is by like wearing a kente cloth and kneeling on the floor of the House of Representatives, and that's the appropriate way to protest. And then you got to vote for Democrats.
Go home, write a check for $5, and then vote. Like that's what. And the other thing, of course, that drives me crazy, and I think that this is also true of people of our generation and younger, as opposed to an older generation, is that older folks still continue to treat the Republican Party as something of an institution that is like an honest institution, right? That is operating in good faith. and that there is a part of the Republican Party that is kind of taken over, that is maybe operating in bad faith, but mostly what we need to do is get a good faith Republican Party back in operation. I've never seen a good faith Republican operation in my lifetime, right? George Bush and Al Gore, that was the first election that I participated in, and didn't see anything resembling good faith coming out of the Bush administration. People weirdly talk about Bush now as somebody who respected the norms of government, and it's like, I opposed the Iraq War and they accused me of treason.
Yeah.
Basically, like that is what they did, like what they did to Max Cleland. So my point being that when you have all of these things, then the Democratic Party establishment get very freaked out and they want to back away from it, because they don't want to be painted as encouraging all of this stuff. And they don't want to be painted as radicals who are trying to destroy American cities. Dude, that's what Republican ads are going to say no matter what.
Yeah.
So
you can
either embrace it. You can either embrace it and take the positive and take the power that is being generated, or you can cut yourself off from all of that and still be accused of doing all the things that you don't want to be accused of doing. So, like, those are your options. There is not an option where Republicans do not accuse Democrats of being like radical communists who want to destroy America. Full stop.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's where like my sort of like good faith reading of some of the things that they do like runs out. We gotta go because we're running up on time. Mike, where can people find about what you're up to? Where can people find either Revolutions or any of the other stuff you have?
You can find the Revolutions podcast wherever you find any podcasts. It's everywhere. You can find the History of Rome too, which is out there. And then I've written 2 books, which are also both available anywhere. One is Hero of Two Worlds. The other is Storm Before the Storm, the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic, both of which I actively encourage you to go find your local bookseller and buy it from them and not from the website that shall not be named, that doesn't need your book sale money to operate, right? Why don't you give your money to people who actually need book sale money to operate their businesses?
Yeah. Good. We love bookstores, don't we, folks? So thank you so much, Mike. And you have been listening to Good Morning Comrade on WHIV LP New Orleans. We love you. Goodbye. Yeah, thanks, man. Sorry, like...